So, hi, everybody. I think we're live. Welcome to the Delta CX podcast. I'm your friendly hostess, Debbie Lovett of deltacx.com. You are joining us on March 16th, 2020. Our super special guest today is Sheri Byrne-Haber, the person I've met on LinkedIn who I think knows the most about accessibility. So, we're going to be talking about accessibility today. If you are joining live, please make sure if you have any questions or comments, you can leave them in the LinkedIn chat room or the YouTube chat room. I do monitor both of them. Uh, Please subscribe on YouTube at deltacx.tv. That's a redirect that will dump you on the YouTube channel. Better to watch us there, less delay and higher quality video. And they're better about telling you that I'm live than LinkedIn is. So while I open up the usual chat windows, I'd love Sheri to introduce herself.
Hi, I'm Sheri Byrne-Haber. I don't know that I know the most about accessibility, but I've been working exclusively with people with disabilities for about 18 years, about half of which has been completely focused on digital accessibility. The first half, I was actually an advocate for the deaf. So my story is I have a computer science degree, a law degree, and an MBA, which is a really good intersection point.
Slacker.
Well, I did a degree every decade. That's the joke in my family. I didn't do them like all in one 11-year run. I have a congenital mobility problem. I was born with club feet and kyphoscoliosis. So I've been a wheelchair user off and on most of my life. Hashtag ambulatory wheelchair user. We do exist. I can walk short distances, but sometimes people think I'm a cheater when they see me getting up and then hauling my wheelchair out of my trunk. But I actually got into accessibility because of my daughter. So my middle daughter has significant hearing loss, and I won several lawsuits against her school district and her insurance company. And I thought when I was finished, okay, I'm a lawyer and I speak English. That's an unfair advantage. So went to work for a nonprofit, gave up doing intellectual property, just sued insurance companies and school districts who were jerking around families with deaf kids. Won a class action lawsuit against Blue Cross. That kind of put me out of business because all the insurance companies caved after that point and said, okay, what am I going to do now? And this thing called digital accessibility was just getting started at that point. So that's how I ended up where I am today. My famous go-to phrase is, would you like me to code that for you? Because when somebody claims that something is hard,
That's too hard.
that it's not really that hard.
Right. What, an ARIA tag? Oh, I don't have time.
That might take me 4 days.
Oh yeah. Love that stuff. So just so everybody's on the same page, hey, give us a definition of accessibility just in case people are not familiar with that term or concept.
Sure. So I blog twice a week on accessibility, and I published a blog a couple weeks ago called How to Construct an Accessibility Elevator Pitch. And so that was one of the 5 parts of the elevator pitch, is explain what accessibility is. Accessibility can be really dry if it's not something that you're passionate about. So my favorite definition of accessibility is, if Stephen Hawking were still alive, he would need to be able to use your software. Because I think that gives everybody an instant mental image of the smartest person on the planet and the struggles that he faced and the assistive technology that he used. And yet he was still able to be the smartest person on the planet because he had that available to him.
Well, that definitely sums it up. Now, from the definitions that I've seen, we have to consider, and tell me if I miss anything here, vision, hearing, motion, cognitive, and emotional, permanent disabilities, temporary disabilities, or just situations.
Yes, absolutely. Disability is the largest minority on the planet. If you look at disabilities under one umbrella, it's between 15 and 20% of the population, depending on what you look at. But what my daughter needs, which is largely things like closed captioning, isn't the same that a kid with anxiety needs or somebody who's blind needs. You hear a lot of focus on vision loss, and that's not because vision loss is the most common disability. It isn't. It's because it's the hardest disability to accommodate. If you're taking something innately visual like software and web pages and you're trying to make it work for somebody who can't see well or who can't see at all.
Right. Like we were we were part of the same topic the other day where we were talking about like some of the software that replicates the sticky notes like Mural and Miro. And I Googled for what Mural had to say about accessibility, and they claimed that their software was accessible. Now, of course, I didn't poke them on that. I didn't ask anybody about it, but I would love to hear from people with real accessibility needs if they think Mural is accessible.
Yeah, I took somebody else's assessment at face value that it wasn't. I did look at Miro. Miro is crap. If you're going to take a sticky note piece of software and make it accessible, the best thing to do is to start with something like Fun Retro and refit it. And so I'm thinking about doing that as a project right now, because I just had it up to my eyeballs with sticky note exercises. I mean, forget leaving out people who are blind. You know, try getting around in a wheelchair in a crowded conference room so that you can get to the flip chart and put up your sticky notes that are illegible because you have rheumatoid arthritis and have trouble handwriting. And that would be me. So yeah, super fed up.
Yeah, and this is the reality for people. And I try to remind people that while you're dreaming that accessibility is just that completely blind person over there who your company has decided to pretend doesn't somehow use your software or your system, but I try to remind people it's almost everybody you know.
It is.
Everybody has a sister, a parent, a cousin, a grandparent with something that for them is debilitating or makes them have certain needs. And we all know these people. Why isn't there more empathy for this? These are the people you love.
Yes, so I always say that there's two groups of people. One is a group with a current disability, and one is a group that is going to have a future disability. So when you're designing for accessibility, you're really designing for your future self.
Yeah, if obviously those of us with empathy can design for others, and those of us with less empathy can say, what will I need down the road? And I remember talking to a lawyer in Florida, because when all those Florida municipalities were getting sued, a couple of them reached out to me like, can you help us fix our accessibility? And ultimately we really couldn't, because we wanted to redo their websites, and they were like, oh, we don't have the budget for that. Like, can't you just
Right,
fix this?
but we have the budget to defend a lawsuit and pay off a plaintiff and pay off the next plaintiff and pay off the next plaintiff.
Actually, the municipalities that I spoke to took down their websites. They said, rather than be sued, we're just going to have no website.
I have seen that happen. My daughter personally experienced when she was in a grad program that rather than caption videos, one of her professors took down the videos and told everybody in the class the videos were no longer available because of my daughter.
That sounds like a lawsuit waiting to happen. Yeah, and I had something similar. I spoke at a conference, and I said, hey, almost every conference I speak at now video records these, so that later on this can be on YouTube. And I love sharing out the talks that I do live. Will this one be available? And I was told this will not be video recorded because they once had a deaf person make what they felt were unnecessary, not unnecessary, but kind of like more requests than were appropriate, related to, they wanted an interpreter, and they wanted two interpreters, and they wanted this and that, and the conference was supposed to supply that for them, and this person's decision was just, well, we just won't video any of the presenters. And my thought was,
it's still a problem.
That doesn't fix that.
Yeah, that doesn't solve the problem, because first of all, that still doesn't help you for the live version of the conference. And the reason why you get two interpreters is because, hey, interpreters get tired.
Yeah, they're supposed to switch off like every hour or just under an hour?
No, it's actually every 15 minutes.
Oh, really? Okay, I've seen them go for longer.
It depends. Usually I see 15, 20 minutes.
Okay.
And they have to understand the terminology or be prepped for the terminology in advance. I can't tell you how many times I've seen the word Kubernetes, which is a really common word in the world that I come from, completely mistranscribed. So
right.
There's prep time, there's interpretation time, there's break time. Interpreters, like the interpreter killer, is repetitive stress. Their hands are their livelihoods. And so any interpreter that's halfway decent isn't going to go for more than 20 minutes.
Okay, so I must have some old, outdated information. Thanks for updating. So,
Well, and also the European standards might be different than the US
no,
standards.
this was some old American stuff, but really old. So I'm probably thinking a little outdated. But last year, maybe just November, I was in Connecticut and I was doing a talk at a university, and I was just doing one of my usual talks that I do everywhere. And all of a sudden, two women came in and sat down, and a whole bunch of people came in, and someone came up to me and said, "Oh, we forgot to tell you, but this woman brings her own sign language interpreter." And I said, but I didn't get to prepare this woman for some of the terms that I'm going to use. And the interpreter came over to me and I said, "Hey, I'm going to be talking a lot about this and this and this and this." And she said, "I've been interpreting for this woman for almost 20 years. I've heard these terms." And I was like, okay. But she was the only interpreter. She didn't switch out. So I guess, I don't know, maybe some people carry their own personal interpreters.
Yeah, they can do that, especially children, hearing children of deaf adults, which are called, the abbreviation is CODA, a child of deaf adult. They will frequently interpret for their parents. So I went to a conference in November in Ecuador where a child was interpreting for his deaf parents, but it was still, there was somebody occasionally switching off with him.
So let's get to what's going to be on a lot of people's minds. And remember, everybody, we are live. So if we have anybody who's watching who wants to ask any questions about accessibility, now is a great time. We've got 6 live watchers. So it's it's our usual light audience, but I know it's a Monday.
I picked a bad Monday.
No, look, when is a good Monday in this world right now?
Everybody's stressed out over, when do I go shopping, and, do I
have enough toilet paper?
Right.
I know people keep asking me if I have toilet paper. Heads up, I do. And you know what? You don't have to ask. I'm going to be okay.
And so does Betty White. So she's good. That was the big meme in the US last week. And the other big meme is, anybody with coronavirus, stay away from Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
That one I saw. Yeah. In general, I don't read the news and stay on top of these, but that one I happened to see. So a lot of people, unfortunately, a lot of companies don't always invest in accessibility or care about accessibility because they think, especially in America, well, legally, I don't have to. And I hear this also sometimes from Australia or England, where the law might be, so if some laws are all businesses must do this, and some countries' laws are, well, only if it's federal or municipal or government. What is, at least in America, what is the current legal requirement for anybody to have, say, an accessible digital product?
So there's 2 different branches. The first branch is, do you do business with the federal government or anybody who gets money from the federal government? When you think, I call that the Jerry Maguire law. It's known as Section 508,
Yes.
and it follows the money. So universities, telecom, museums, hospitals, they all get money from the federal government. So it's not just government. Okay, that comes under something called there's Section 504 and Section 508. And so if you want to do business with those entities, you have to comply with those laws. A year and a half ago, Section 508, and the word we use is harmonized. It just means blended with WCAG 2.0. So
Okay.
is the standard. Now, Section 508 has existed for 16 years.
And I was going to say WCAG 2.0 is itself 10 years old or whatever.
Right. And it took them, 7 years to do the harmonization for whatever reason. So the law existed for 16 years. The first 14 years, it was pretty much ignored. Okay, since the harmonization has taken place, what's happened is disabled employees or people who are trying to file job applications have been suing the companies saying, hey, I can't get a job, I can't get a transfer, I can't get a promotion because you, Mr. Employer, who gets money from the federal government, have chosen inaccessible software. So the first lawsuit that went to completion on that was about a year ago, February. So that's been out for 13 months. One employee, one employer, $1 million verdict for the disabled employee. Okay, you can't afford it, great, but you can't afford that either. And very few companies, it would actually take $1 million to retrofit their website. Domino's admitted in their—
I was just going to say, we got to talk about Domino's.
We got to talk about Domino's. Domino's admitted it would have cost them $38,000 to remediate their website.
This is going to be the podcast where I do the most eye rolling and the most cringing, because they defended how many appeals? They went how many rounds to try to defend that their website couldn't? So I think it was that blind or visually disabled people couldn't order a pizza.
Couldn't order a pizza. They were forced to go through customer support, but the customer support number wasn't up all the time, and it still wasn't an equal experience because there were deals that they could get on the app that they couldn't get by calling on the phone.
Right.
So remember, it's not about whether you're following WCAG, it's whether or not you're providing an equal experience.
Right.
And the equal experience. So Domino's actually, let me step back here for a second so I can complete answering your original question.
Sorry.
Domino's comes on, no, it's fine. Domino's comes under group number 2. And in the US, group number 2 is the Americans with Disabilities Act. So even if you don't sell to the government, chances are you come under the ADA. There are 13 things that make you and I'm making air quotes here, public accommodation. Having a storefront makes you a public accommodation. And if your website is pushing people to that storefront, even though the internet didn't exist when the ADA was passed, it by extension is part of your public accommodation. So back to Domino's. Domino's won the first round. God only knows how. It was the stupidest decision I've ever read. And I read a lot of stupid decisions. They lost on appeal. Okay, so corrected decision was from the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. They continued to appeal to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, nah, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals was right, go away. They're continuing to contest it. Last time I checked their website, it's still not accessible.
How many, and you've been a lawyer, how many millions of dollars have they spent with lawyers to not spend, let's even say $50,000 or $100,000 being super accessible and fantastic?
So I have had a case that I was involved with that almost went to the Supreme Court. And I would say probably in today's dollars, it's going to be somewhere between 1.75 and 2.25 million to argue a case through 3 rounds, all the way to petitioning for certiorari, which is a fancy way of saying, hey, Mr. Supreme Court, Mrs. Supreme Court, please accept my case.
Right. Oh, man. Ouch, ouch, ouch. Okay, so
but somebody dug their heels in and decided that they wanted to defend this to the death. MIT and Harvard did the same thing. They've been defending lack of captioning in the online courses for 4 years, and MIT finally caved in 6 months ago. Harvard caved in about 6 weeks ago. I just haven't had time to write anything up on it. But yeah, I mean, in the end, it costs you a lot more to defend something that's really undefendable. And Domino's doesn't even consider how many people like me have stopped buying Domino's pizza because we think this is crap. You know,
right.
You are saying that business from my community, my people, is not worth $38,000 to you. They've lost $38,000 in business, you know, above and beyond the legal fees.
Yeah, I mean, we often see some boycotts or attempted boycotts from some companies, especially in America, when the company sometimes comes out with a political stance that's very divisive. And then you have liberals or left-leaning people saying, do this, you know, do business with them or don't. And then you have conservative or right-leaning people saying the opposite. And then the company always hopes the do business with us wins, but sometimes those companies have had to change in response to a very quick and swift boycott.
Yeah, and that happened to Target. Target was the first major case that it was involving digital accessibility back in 2006, and then it happened again when they gave large amounts of money to anti-gay organizations. So they were swiftly and quickly and thoroughly boycotted by people like me until, you know, they did a whole bunch of mea culpas and reversed it. And literally, I didn't set foot in a Target for about 3 years because of that.
And I want to encourage everybody else that if you are only watching certain issues and boycotting based on your usual pet issues, start thinking about accessibility, follow the lawsuits, look at who is working against all of these people, our family, our neighbors, our friends, our LinkedIn contacts, and speak with your dollar as well, because it can't just be Sheri doing this. We all have to join in to that's what the whole ally thing is about, and so I want to encourage everybody to join in those efforts and help make sure these companies doing the wrong thing hear some additional voices. Anyway, that's just my soapbox moment. I'm going to shift to the conversation and hold up this picture I showed you before we started. This is my book. Everybody, please buy it. I only get $3, but please buy it anyway. So this is from my book, and I'm talking about accessibility and diversity and inclusion. And those of you watching the video version will see that this is a person in a wheelchair on a beautiful sunny day outdoors with their arms outstretched, looking to the sky, looking like everything's going just great. And the wording on the page says accessibility coming soon, because this was the page. Somehow there was a page on this website about accessibility, as if accessibility is just putting up a page, and it wasn't even available yet. But when you and I talked before the show started, you told me something I didn't know about stock photos, and I'm going to let you tell everybody what you told me.
So, I used to be a musician. I was a concert flute player for a long time before the arthritis took over and made that not so easy anymore. And I can tell when I'm watching somebody in a movie playing the piano, playing the flute, playing an instrument that I'm familiar with, whether or not they're faking it. Are they really playing? Because we can tell by the fingering, we can tell by the embouchure.
That's the mouth position for those just listening.
Mouth position, yeah. So, likewise, I can tell by looking at a picture whether or not somebody in a wheelchair is actually a wheelchair user. More often than not, I'm going to be right. It's whether, is it one of those standard $119 wheelchairs that somebody got, out of the back of Walmart, or is it something that's customized to them? Is it dinged up? If it's all shiny and perfect and new, guess what? They're not a real wheelchair user.
It's a prop.
Because wheelchairs get dragged in and out of the back of cars. Somebody asked me once, where was my dog? And I said, what dog? And they're like, well, the back of your car underneath the lip of the trunk is covered in scratches. And I'm like, oh, that's just my wheelchair when I'm tired at the end of the day and I can't always lift it up to the right angle to get it into my trunk. It's scraping the paint, but it looks like, claw marks. So yeah, we can tell. Chances are if the person's wearing nylons, which I think the person in that photo was, they're not going to be a person in a wheelchair because we hate trying to put on nylons. There's a certain amount of muscle wastage involved. I remember going to see a play on Broadway in New York called Spring Awakening, and it was largely about deaf individuals, but they had a character in a wheelchair. And as soon as she came out on stage, I turned to my husband and I said, look, she's a real wheelchair user. Look at that chair. It's totally customized for her. And look at one of her legs. There's almost no muscle there. That's how you can tell they're not faking it. Because the only thing worse than doing it wrong is doing it wrong and faking that you're not doing it wrong.
Yeah, so it's a reminder to people, just like you wouldn't regionalize your website using Google Translate. You would want to get a real speaker of the language to write or edit or review the text for other languages that you're using for a website or a digital product or a printed product. If you believe you are going to put up stock photos of people with accessibility needs or disabilities, please talk to people who fit into that group and make sure this stock photo isn't bull.
Yeah,
isn't insulting.
I'm still working on stock photos at our company, and we're using Getty Images now, and Getty has a special disability-related section. But some companies, their one stock photo is a little old lady in an oversized wheelchair in a medical setting with a person of color helping her out.
Oh boy, that reminds me of the time I went to a stock photo site and I put in female manager, and all the pictures that came back was a female employee being berated by a male manager.
Yeah, it's not just disabilities, right? It's everything. It's all of diversity and inclusion.
Yeah. So
The
we were
other,
talking, go ahead.
oh, I was just going to say, the other thing I hate about stock photos is half of them probably come under the category of inspiration porn.
I was just
where
going to
you-
ask you about inspiration porn.
Okay. So inspiration porn is a great phrase coined by the
Stella.
late Stella Young from Australia.
Did you say the late? Did she pass away?
She passed away about 2.5 years ago.
I had no idea. Oh, I'll have to Google that.
Her particular genetic diagnosis was very prone to aneurysms, and she had an aneurysm.
Oh, I'm so sorry to hear that. But if
Yeah,
you guys
I was
Google
too.
inspiration porn, and she did a TED talk, and
Yeah,
that's
her TED talk
watching.
is amazing. I did
Yeah.
an article called "The Top 10 TED Talks on Disability and Accessibility," and hers was number one.
I'm not surprised. Okay, so tell us the definition of inspiration porn.
Inspiration porn is imagery of people with disabilities that are only there to make people without disabilities feel good. So somebody who is working out and in a gym and has no legs, or somebody who's skiing with a prosthetic. Now, if it's an article that's about adaptive skiing, then it's not inspiration porn, right? Because it's an article about adaptive skiing, and the message is, look, people with disabilities can ski. If it's an article saying, the only bad attitude, or the only disability in life is a bad attitude.
Look, this guy with one leg is skiing.
Yeah, why can't you? That's so damaging in so many dimensions, because first of all, it doesn't give you the true picture of what it's like to live with a prosthetic and how hard it was for that person to even find a place that they could ski. Second, of the end of Stella's shredding of that quote is that there's no magical, I'm paraphrasing here, sorry, Stella's relatives, there's no magical way to turn all these books into Braille. Nothing is going to turn stairs into a ramp. The barriers are the barriers that society puts in front of us. The barrier is not the disability, is the way people need to look at it in the end, to be truly inclusive and to promote belonging.
Yeah, everybody look up that TED talk. That was just tremendous. And I think one of the things that struck me the most was the beginning of her story, where she talks about how she was a teenager and she didn't think she was that amazing a person, but someone from her town came up to her and they were like, "We want to give you an award." And she was like, "For doing what?" And they had some award like good citizen or something. And she was like, "I haven't done anything." And she's like, even my parents were like, "You haven't done anything." And they wanted to give her an award just for being a disabled person, evidently. And that was the start of the TED talk in her story.
Yeah, and nobody's offered to give me an award, but I do the same thing over and over. Oh, you're so brave. Oh, you're so strong.
You're so inspiring.
I hear that. The last trip I took coming back from Seattle a few weeks ago, it was, oh, I can't believe you're traveling by yourself. And it's like, I have a job. This is part of my job, so I do it. I don't think it requires any particular strength or belief. It's just a commitment to living as normal of a life as possible and doing what I want to do.
Yeah, people think that that's being sensitive to disabled people, but in reality, it seems to be totally pooping on their integrity and maybe fetishizing, I think.
I think their intentions are in a good place. And so I try to think of it, from that point of view, but sometimes it's really hard. I kind of draw the line at the groups of people who want to pray over me for healing. It's like, okay, if God had wanted me healed, he would have done it, 50 plus years ago.
Yeah, that's a tough one as well. I try not to write too much about religion. I've written a little bit, but yeah, that's tough because it's all about us superimposing ourselves onto others. And I think when people do this inspiration stuff, I tend to think they're imagining, oh God, what would I do if I were in that case? And I think there's a huge amount of fear there. And I don't know if it was Stella or somebody else who were saying something like, many people seem to think like being disabled is like the worst thing that could happen.
It's negative. It's horrible. There but for the grace of God. Sorry to bring up religion again. Go I kind of thing. And what they don't realize is, especially for people with congenital disabilities, we've spent decades developing coping mechanisms and workarounds. We know what we can do. We know what we can't do. We know what we have to plan for. We know what we need to bring with us. Our backup plans have backup plans. So,
Yeah, an interesting thing that I ended up talking about with Sheila for my book, and I ended up talking to my Italian teacher since I'm learning Italian. And at one point, my Italian teacher was saying that like some of the language around disability was changing in Italian, and that deaf people were being called something like non-hearing. And I brought that up to Sheila, my friend who's interviewed in the book, who works very closely with deaf people. And she said, ask your Italian teacher if the deaf people want to be called deaf or non-hearing, because that sounds like something that the hearing community would do, thinking they're being very sensitive to the deaf people. And so I went back to my Italian teacher, I asked her the question, and she said, actually, all of my deaf friends call themselves deaf and call each other deaf, but when they're dealing with like the municipality or the regional government, they have to use non-hearing because that's the term that they've been writing into laws and things like that.
It's the term that makes other people feel comfortable.
Right. And so let's talk about how I remember you posting on LinkedIn, you know, hey, we talk about what are our pronouns. There's a huge spectrum of what people with disability want to be referred to as. Tell us about that.
So where we've made really great advances in diversity and inclusion is with gender identification, where people now will say what their pronouns are. You know, hi, I'm Sheri Byrne-Haber and my pronouns are she and hers. So why not choose a disability pronoun? And I realize it's not really a pronoun, but I'm trying to link it to somewhere where we've made advances already, where I can look, it's okay to call me disabled. Okay, that is the term that I am most comfortable with. But there are regional differences between the EU and North America. But what's happening is people with disabilities are starting to reclaim their identity. So there's a movie coming out, I think it's coming out in 9 days, called Crip Camp. Okay, we refer to each other as cripples, and amongst us, that is not considered a bad word. Whereas if somebody who didn't appear to be disabled called me a cripple, I might kind of look at them a little strange. People want to say, I am autistic. They don't want to hear you're a person on the spectrum, you're a person with Asperger's.
You have special needs.
Right. Special needs is another one, where they consider it 100% part of their identity. So people first language, which is what largely we use in the US, is starting to be replaced with identity-based language, where it's, if I'm writing an article for the general public, I might be using people first language because largely my readers are North American and that's what they expect and that's what they're not offended by. But if I'm talking about myself, I definitely used identity-based language.
So yeah, because I remember there was a period in America where we were all told to say differently abled. But then in the last few years, I've heard people say, oh my God, stop saying differently abled.
Yes, I've never been a fan of differently abled, even when it was considered to be the right language to use.
Yeah, so we have to ask, and even Sheila says that in the book, like, you want to know what to call somebody, ask them. And she says every person she meets, she asks them, what do you want me to call your disability? Or whether this person has had head trauma or they're deaf or they're going through cancer treatment. What do you want me to call what you're experiencing or what you have or things like that. So
the only common thing I'm familiar with in the US is what we call lowercase d deaf versus capital D deaf.
Okay.
So lowercase d deaf are the oral deaf. They're the people who typically don't sign, who don't come from multi-generational deaf families. Where a capital D deaf, if you ever see D in the uppercase and it's not the first word of a sentence, you're probably talking about somebody who signs, who comes from a deaf family, who considers being deaf part of their identity and not something that needs to be fixed.
Interesting. Okay, because I remember Sheila using hard of hearing and wanting that to have initial capital letters.
Yeah, that's probably for the same reason. Hearing loss is another currently acceptable term. Hearing impaired is not. Now, The weird thing is hearing impaired 28 years ago when my daughter was born was the preferred term. And
Closed captioned for the hearing impaired.
Exactly. So she still thinks of herself as hearing impaired, but she's actually in audiology school right now. So when she's working with other people who are deaf, she has to make sure that she's using the term that's most comfortable for them and not the term that's most comfortable for her.
So circling back a little more to digital accessibility, let's say that someone, especially working in UX or CX, knows that accessibility is the right thing to do for a zillion reasons, but they might have management or stakeholders who might act like, we don't really need accessibility. It's not really the law. Why should we invest in it? There's always people who push back, as you know. What are some of the chief arguments or approaches someone can use when they're trying to, I don't want to say sell it because it shouldn't be for sale, but to promote the fact that it's a good idea to do?
Yes, so it's really all about making a business case for it, and this is where my MBA comes into play, where I say, okay, your surveys aren't accessible. How would you react if there was a headline on LinkedIn tomorrow morning saying, fill in the blank customer, not interested in input from people who are blind? Okay, because that is the headline when you aren't making your surveys accessible to people who are blind. Okay, there's brand damage, there's reputation harm. There is all of the crap associated with lawsuits. And frankly, not many companies are dominoes. Most companies can't afford a multi-million-dollar, multi-year battle to defend a defenseless position. And there's the question of how much business are you losing? There's a study that said 91% of people with disabilities, if they go to a website that's inaccessible and they can't get the information they want or they can't make the transaction that they want, they go to a competitor and they never even complain. We just get tired of complaining.
Yeah, and quick reminder to those watching live, we are live. So if you have any questions for the fantastic Sheri in the world of accessibility, please ask them. I'm monitoring LinkedIn and YouTube, but otherwise I'm going to keep going. And I remember Sheila talking about some of this for the book as well. I should really find the Sheila interview since so much of this is relevant. Oh, there it went. There it went. There's a picture of her in here. I had her teach us some signs, which was hard because my book is a book and sign language is motion. It's musical. It's fluid. And I was like, oh, crap. I have to take a screenshot of this and try to explain it.
It's even body language. So
yeah, facial expressions.
I sent a message to somebody on LinkedIn a couple of days ago saying, if I see one more person forwarding that article, and this goes back to inspiration porn, on sign language gloves, I'm going to lose my shit.
Sheila actually mentioned sign language gloves in here. You would love Sheila. Yeah, she actually said, where did it end up? Yeah, it's actually in this page here. She said, Sheila also wanted to recommend an article about how all of the inventions of sign language gloves aren't for deaf people.
Right. That's short and sweet and sums it up. And because there's so many things that it just doesn't take into account.
And and it's like, and I need your communication style to work for me.
Right.
Yeah, I'm trying. There's something else I was going to say. Oh, yeah, that's another thing that now that I'm looking through my own book was I remember at one point I looked up what is the ADA's list of people who qualify under the ADA. And I was so shocked at some of the things that were there. And I wish more people knew about this. And again, some of you live in other countries, so you have to look up your own countries or government's list of what
so in the UK, it's the DDA. In Australia, it's also the DDA. So it's the Disabled Discrimination Act. Canada is the ACA. It's the Accessible Canada Act that was just passed. And then in one province, they have their own called AOTA, which is the Accessibility for Ontarians Disability Act. And then
read these lists.
In Europe, there's either the EAA, which is the European Accessibility Act, or something called EN 301549, which is the actual regulation that the EU started that all the member states had to adopt. And then in Britain, now, thank you, Brexit, they've gone back to what's called BS 8878, BS for British Scientific. It's the...
Not for the usual.
Not for the other BS. Okay. So that is the WCAG 2.0 standard, since in Britain they can't point to the European Accessibility Act anymore.
And my point is because when I talk about accessibility to people, they imagine the blind person, they imagine the deaf person, or maybe they imagine a paralyzed person. But then I read the ADA and it was like people with heart disease, people with carpal tunnel, people who are going through cancer treatment and find that their cognition is off, people with depression, because depression can change the way that you think or move or live. And I was just amazed.
Yeah, it's anything that limits a major thing that you need to do in life. Okay, there's nothing about it's temporary or permanent. There's nothing about, well, you could use crutches or you could use eyeglasses or you could use hearing aids, because the law was getting somewhat constrained by court decisions saying, well, if you could accommodate it and you hadn't, then you weren't really disabled. And so in 2008, it was actually updated with the ADA as amended. So it's the ADAAA, you know, and that's where it got more specific about mental health, about medication. You know, if you're an epileptic on medication under the old ADA, you would not be considered disabled, but under the new ADA, you are.
Because the medication was controlling it or hoping to control it.
Exactly. And now it doesn't matter anymore. If you're an epileptic, you're an epileptic. It doesn't matter how good your control is. It doesn't matter why your control is bad. Maybe your control is bad because you're in the US and you have crappy health insurance and you can't afford the medications, right?
Oh, don't get us started.
Yeah, I know.
I know. Well, I'm over here now.
So just so you know, my MBA thesis,
yeah.
I know how much of me you can see, but this is my insulin pump. I always say that people see the wheelchair and they automatically think they know why I'm disabled. My wheelchair is just a way of me getting around. Okay, my type 1 diabetes is my disability. This interferes with every piece of food I put in my mouth. You know, if I get sick, if I get hormonal, all these things factor into how much insulin I take. And my MBA thesis was on, if I have no insurance and I'm out of insulin and I go to an emergency room and ask for a bottle of insulin, they say, no, go away. Okay. If I come back 10 days later in diabetic ketoacidosis with permanent kidney damage and say, hey, I'm in DKA, I need insulin. Guess what? They shell out $250,000 worth of care to give you a kidney transplant and give you insulin. That could have been prevented if they'd handed you a $200 bottle of insulin and then, you know, let's get the whole, I could have bought that bottle of insulin in Canada for $31 and it's the same insulin. So yeah, you know, I always remind people 70% of disabilities are hidden, first of all, flat out. If you're targeting 7% of employees with disabilities, which is supposed to be the goal in the US, that means 1 out of every 30 people has to have a visible disability and 1 out of every 7 has to have an invisible disability that they're willing to discuss, okay? Color blindness, mental health, dyslexia, chronic pain, asthma, you know,
cancer.
The list, cancer, past cancer. You can be in remission and you can still be disabled from having had cancer in the past.
Yes. I've heard there can be long-lasting cognitive effects from cancer treatment.
Chemo brain, they call it.
Yeah, that's what I've heard. Yeah. I also wanted to talk about, I think it came from Microsoft. It was some sort of document they had on accessibility, and they had kind of broken down disabilities into three general groups. Permanent, you only have one arm. Temporary, one of your arms is in a sling and you can't use it. And situational, you're holding a baby in your arm and you can't use that arm. Have you seen that document? Do you have thoughts on that? Can that be improved?
I do like it, and I see Microsoft having a slightly different angle on it. We largely think of Microsoft as a software company, but they're becoming really, really well known for their accessible gaming equipment. And so not only are they thinking about it from the digital accessibility perspective, which is largely what my focus is, they're thinking about from how do I use switches? How do I communicate with other people who are doing the group gaming, you know, multi-person role-playing game thing? And so I think when you're talking about physical things that you have to interact with, the temporary, permanent, and situational breakdown is really helpful.
Yeah, because it's a great reminder to people that it's not just the person with one arm, but it's the person who situationally doesn't, like I always would say to people in meetings, they would say, well, our customers, they can use this easily. And I'd say, okay, but how will they use this if they're riding the bus and they have a baby in one arm and they're trying to hold onto the bus with the other while using their phone? Is this still easy to use?
In the sunlight. You left off in the sunlight.
Right. Thank you. I want to tell you about a talk I went to at a conference. I won't say what talk or what conference, but it was a very well-known company was talking about some work they had done to make, I think, one of their internal tools more accessible. They had found that the accessibility of this internal tool that was used by developers and engineers was pretty much inaccessible. And they even found that someone at their company who worked on these engineering teams was legally blind. And so their talk, and this was a UX conference, but I won't say which one, was about how they ended up being able to make this tool accessible. But what surprised me was they basically told the story of they found the one guy who was legally blind, and they interviewed him, they made a persona of him, they tested with him, and that was it. And I'm listening to this and I'm thinking, you're like Fortune 50 and you found that this tool was inaccessible and you only asked one guy? One guy is better than 0 guys, but do you have an opinion on how many people with a certain disability we talk to or test with? You look frozen, but it could be me. Audience, am I frozen or is she frozen? Audience? She's frozen? Okay, she appears to be frozen. My question was maybe just too much. No, she might just be having a technical issue, so I'm hoping she'll join us again quickly. Meanwhile, while Sheri is in hyperspace, if anybody has any questions, I know we have a few people watching in LinkedIn and some in YouTube. If you guys have any questions about accessibility and especially how to bring it to your businesses and companies, please ask those questions now. We've only got about 10 or so more minutes, and I would love to give your questions to Sheri when she returns to the Zoom meeting. Meanwhile, I might have to repeat that story, but this is the fun of the live podcast that does not get edited later. Hello, people listening. How are you? Meanwhile, LinkedIn is like 6 minutes behind, so they don't even know what's going on. People on LinkedIn, please subscribe to our YouTube channel at deltacx.tv. The video quality on LinkedIn is poorer. You're less likely to know that I'm live, and you're many minutes behind where we are. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel. It's not monetized. You're not going to get ads. You can get there at deltacx.tv, and hopefully you'll be able to subscribe there. And Jeffrey says she is frozen. Let's see. She says I can't get back on. Okay, let's try again. Let's see. Copy link location. Try this. Yeah, so thank you, Jeffrey. That helps. Anybody have any questions while we're waiting for her to try to dial back in? Hopefully this is not the end.
I think
you're here. You made it.
We're testing the I am. I think we're testing the limits of Zoom this week in California because everybody's using. They gave it away for free to teachers in California. And yeah, the teachers are probably coming online right about now.
So yeah, I had Mural Die last week when we were doing a live podcast and we were using Mural Live, and Mural died. And I think they were also offering something for free. And this is where we all learned that nobody has invested in DevOps and server scalability.
Well, or they have, but not foreseen the impact that a work from home pandemic would create in terms of the
Yes.
load. So you were telling me about how they focus things around one
I have a
person
story, and then we do have a
persona.
question from the chat room
Okay.
as well. So I was
Oh,
talking
great.
about famous Fortune 50 company is doing this talk at this conference. I don't know how much you got. And long story short, they redesigned their product to be accessible, but they interviewed the one guy at their company that they found was blind. They made a persona out of him, named after him. They tested with him, and they gave this talk at this conference like, look at us,
Look at us, aren't we wonderful? We solved the problem.
And I sat there thinking, okay, look, I'm glad you hopefully made this accessible to the blind or those with visual issues. And one guy is better than zero guys, but what the hell? You're a Fortune 50 company. There's got to be more people than this one person. And I was asking you if you had an opinion on how many people with visual issues should have been part of that research or testing to make sure that this was the right direction to go with the product.
So typically I use at least 6. The most important 2 delineation factors is somebody with significant vision loss who uses magnification versus somebody who's a screen reader user. Okay, so that's one delineation that's absolutely essential.
Okay.
Somebody who with color vision deficiency. Okay, so do they have normal vision except they're colorblind? Color vision deficiency is the new, politically correct term for colorblind. And then also somebody who's congenitally blind versus somebody with acquired blindness. You cannot underestimate the psychological difference between the two, because if you're congenitally blind, vision is not something you look at as, oh, I miss it. It's something that you've been dealing with forever. You've developed these compensatory skills. You know how to use assistive technology. Whereas if you have somebody in their middle ages who loses their vision due to retinitis pigmentosa or optical neuritis are the 2 most common forms of sudden vision loss, glaucoma. I have glaucoma, so there you go. I've had 5 eye surgeries in the last couple of years. Versus somebody in their 80s with macular degeneration. That's a completely different mindset as well. So if you're doing something that is even looking at the older population, you need to look at natural aging processes and deterioration in hearing and vision loss. So I would say in terms of personas, you need 6, and those would be the ones that I would choose. So I actually did a CSUN paper on this with
our good friends at CSUN.
Not my good friends at CSUN anymore, my formerly good friends at CSUN, and given how vocal I've been about how unhappy I am with them, I'm probably not going back anytime soon. But I worked with David Fazio at a company called Helix Opportunities, and he specializes in finding people that fit the personas for this type of testing. So it doesn't matter if you don't have the people on staff. You can find people like David, or you can find people, I know Nobility is another company that does this, where they will find the people that fit your personas for you.
Excellent. That was my thought during this talk was this seems extremely self-congratulatory, and why'd you only use one guy?
And they didn't even know enough to know that was bad, which is the really frightening part. It's one thing to say we should have had 6 people, but we only had this one at our disposal, so this is what we've done so far. But not even knowing that was wrong is really the disgusting part.
They seemed really proud of it, and I was honestly kind of surprised that the talk got accepted, because I would think that I wonder how they represented the talk, because if I were seeing that talk, I would have been like, oh, holy cats. We would never put up a UX talk where someone said, we designed an entire product based on one guy.
Right.
That wouldn't be a UX talk.
I got a question. What's my question? I love questions.
Yes, you got a question. Okay, so I was like, what? Okay, I love questions too. This question asks, this person says they do a lot of web design, and so not totally in the UX world yet, but as a web designer, while complete accessibility should be the target, is there a list of priorities Sheri would recommend to focus on when getting started with a website project?
Sure. So the standard that I like to see followed is called WCAG 2.1 level AA. So let's break that down for a second. WCAG is Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. The new major version that's going to be coming out in 2 years is dropped the WC because they cover PDF files. They cover mobile. There's no reason to limit what they're talking about with the WC part. So AG, accessibility guidelines, you remember your high school chemistry, that's the periodic table symbol for silver. So it's called Project Silver.
Very good.
2.1 is the version that came out July 2018. So it's the most recent version that's out there. 2.2 is coming out this November. Only a couple of changes proposed so far, really minor stuff. So going with 2. The older standard is fine. You don't have to wait until November. Level AA is the middle level of the standard. So there's A, which is the deal breakers, AA, which is you're making it really hard, but not impossible. And then AAA is you really want to do this right. Most people don't do AAA. And the reason isn't because they don't want to invest the money. It's because it's really, really restrictive in terms of structure and colors and things like that. So AA is the mid-level standard. The most important 2 guidelines far and away to follow out of the 50. Okay, you hear a lot from design. Oh, yes, my color contrast is good, so I'm accessible. Color contrast is one of the 50 guidelines that you need to follow. It is a really important one, though, because you're going to help people with dyslexia. You're going to help people with autism. You're going to help people from a lot of different persona groups be able to more easily digest the information if you're using the right color combination. So it restricts. It lets you use about 80% of color combinations. 20% are off the table. The ones that are off the table are the pastels, the really light grays that people use for disclaimer language because they really don't want you to see it. Yeah, you have to have 60% saturated gray now at a minimum for anything that's text. So color is important. Why is color important? People are married to their damn colors, okay? I'm not a designer, so I don't get it. I'm like, guys, it's only a color, okay? But I worked for-
But it's our brand.
I worked for a company that was really wedded to their French fry yellow. So I can tell you, I've heard it before many, many times. So colors are very hard to change psychologically. And so and they may be tied to collateral. So you may have brochures that you're handing out or bags that you're printing things on where the colors match what's on the website. And it takes a long time to change. So it's not that color is the most important, it's that color is the hardest to change. And so I tend to have that one towards the top of my requirement list. And the other requirement that I consider really, really important is keyboard access. Because all assistive technology relies on the keyboard being fully functional underneath. You need to be able to use the software or the website without ever touching the screen and without ever touching a mouse. And if you've seen people with cerebral palsy who use switches or even the screen readers, they rely on keyboard use because people who are blind can't use mice. They don't know where the cursor is. They're going to be completely hosed, you know, in addition to the people with carpal tunnel and some of the more situational types of disabilities. So that's a really important one to solve first as well. But in general, solve the A's first because those are the deal breakers. Okay, I think there's 28, I want to say, out of the 50 requirements are the A levels. Okay. And that's things like closed captioning and labeling your fields properly and things like that. Most of them are what I call 5-minute fixes. Very few of them change what your website looks like. It's all about making it behave nicely behind the scenes with the assistive technology.
And I was on a website even earlier today, and I don't know why, but instead of using my mouse, I started tabbing through the page. And I found that as I moved through the page, I had no idea where my cursor or mouse was because they didn't have a different visual design for the focus state. So when I tabbed to a checkbox, it didn't visually change. And when I tabbed... Yeah, go ahead.
That's a AA requirement right now, but as part of the proposal for the November updates, it's going to be bumped up to an A level requirement.
It should be. I mean, because again, if we're focused on people who are using keyboards, then to me, some of the basics we have to consider are focus state visual cues and skip navigation so that people who are tabbing around don't have to go through your stupid nav menus every time.
There's a tool we use at work where it takes 57 tab presses to get to the footer.
Ooh.
So it's accessible, technically,
sure.
but it's not usable.
Right.
And so that's where things like, I really like the Starbucks skip nav because they have skip to content and skip to footer. You can skip to a bunch of different places. It's not just skip to content. So at a minimum, skip to content is required. So you bypass all the nav. But people are allowed to do better than that.
Right. And it almost sounds like a good skip nav is almost its own nav, as in skip to content or skip to footer or skip to something else. That would be smart.
Skip to anything. Exactly.
Yeah, that would be smart and proactive rather than waiting for someone to sue us.
So originally in WCAG 2.0, it was thou shalt have a focus indicator. Okay. They didn't say what the contrast was. They didn't say what the pattern was. They didn't say anything. So in 2.1, they added thou shalt have a focus indicator and thy focus indicator shall be, and the contrast ratio required was 3.0 to 1. And now with the proposed addition for 2.2, it's thou shalt have a focus indicator with the color, and then they start getting into what patterns are allowed and what, is if it's a dash pattern, is that okay? If it's a flip, if it's an inverse pattern, is that okay?
Oh, okay.
That's the one area where they actually have made some substantial changes because of feedback like yours over time.
Well, excellent. We are technically out of time. Thank you so much for this. It was just jam-packed with a million topics and all of them deeply interesting. And thank you so much. Anything else you want to add quickly? And also tell everybody where they can find your blog and your writings and how they can follow you on LinkedIn or where you amass your fans.
So the only Byrne-Habers on the planet are me and people I've given birth to. So I'm not difficult to find. It's Byrne-Haber. And you can reach out to me on LinkedIn. My blog is I initially publish on Medium because it's easy for me. I like Medium, but Medium isn't super accessible. So they finally did add alt text. And from the reading perspective, it's not terrible. From the authoring perspective, it's still really bad. So if for some reason you're not comfortable using the Medium interface or you don't want to subscribe, once a month, I carry over all my articles to SheriByrne-Haber.com. No hyphen in that one, just run all the letters together, SHERI with the Byrne-Haber. And I've got a book coming out next February. So I'd love to come back and talk about that when it gets closer.
Yes, please. Once it's out, please come back on and plug the heck out of it. Are you allowed to tell us the name of it? Is there anything we can know about it?
The working title is Find Your Accessibility Compass. So I took a poll on LinkedIn of my 10,000 or so connections in UX and accessibility, and far and away the request was for a book on accessibility strategy. And so this is going to be the nuts and bolts of how to set up an accessibility program and what to do first.
Love it. I'm sorry we have to wait until February of next year for that.
Books, they take a while.
I know. I just wrote a book the length of Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire.
And yeah, that probably took you a couple of years, I would imagine.
4 months.
4 months from the time you started until the time it was published?
4.5.
Wow.
I was on fire. I had a few things to say.
Okay.
But no, I found out later that when I tell people that when I say 4.5, they expect me to say years, and then I say months.
Right.
But I was a woman on fire, and those who know me know I am a woman on fire. But anyway, it's not about me, it's about you, and we would love to have you back next year, or of course anytime in between, so that people can keep hearing these things. But certainly when the book comes out, please come plug the heck out of it, and we'll talk more about this.
Let's plan November for when the 2.2 update comes out for WCAG, and then maybe a couple months after that when the book starts shipping.
Excellent. I'll put a note in my calendar to ping you in October to plan November.
Look forward to talking to you again, Debbie.
Everybody follow Sheri on LinkedIn. She posts pretty frequently with always insightful things, and I've learned about many adventures I knew nothing about. As usual, connect with me on LinkedIn. Follow me there. DeltaCX.com is my website, and DeltaCX.tv is our YouTube channel. Please subscribe. Not monetized, no ads, no sponsors. Just come and watch our stuff. So I'm going to wind down the stream for now. But Sheri, thank you again, and I look forward to seeing you around LinkedIn.
Thanks for hosting me.